Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is about a brand new report from the Union of Concerned Scientists. I've done lots of stories about fraudulent reports from the Union of Concerned Scientists in the past, but they've stepped up the dishonesty to an entirely new level with this report. Look at all the words they've got in there. Killer heat, climate choices, dangerously hot days, concerned scientists. So the message here is that scientists are concerned that there will be killer heat in the United States, and it's up to us to make the choices about the future to prevent dangerously hot days. And of course the bottom line of their message is that we need to drastically reduce CO2 emissions. We need to get rid of our cars. We need to get rid of our lifestyles. We need to quit traveling on airplanes. We need to quit taking vacations. We need to quit eating meat, or we're all going to die in a blazing inferno. And these people are scientists and they're concerned. And here are the concerned scientists who wrote the report: Christina Dahl, Erika Spanger-Siegfried, Rachel Licker, Astrid Caldas, John somebody, Nicholas somebody, Rachel Cletus, Shana Udvardy, Juan Declet Barreto, Pamela Worth, July 2019. They picked an interesting time to come out with this report. The last 6 months have been the coolest on record in the United States. This is a graph of the average January to June daily maximum temperature at all NOAA U.S. Historical Climatology Network stations. It shows that the average daily maximum temperature of 57 degrees is tied with 1979 for the coolest on record. 1979 had an extremely cold winter, but this year had a cold winter and a cold spring. And you can see that in this next graph, which is January to June, percent of days over 6 degrees Fahrenheit at all U.S. Historical Climatology Network stations. You can see that this year is by far the coolest. Less than 50% of the temperature readings during the year so far were above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The only other year which that happened was 1979. But the Union of Concerned Scientists has a job to do: spread propaganda. So they waited till the hottest week of the year to come out with this report. Now let's look at the details of the report. Table 1. Extreme heat will become more frequent and more severe in all regions of the country. Usually climate scamsters use words like may become more severe, but in this one they say it will become more severe. They're prophets. And they show the number of 90-degree days per year in the Midwest increasing from 25 at present up to 90 in the future. They show the number of 90-degree days in the Northeast increasing from 13 at present to 70 in the future. The Northern Plains will increase from 13 up to 57. Northwest from 6 up to 37. Southeast from 69 up to 140. Southern Plains from 71 up to 134. Southwest from 37 up to 84. These are huge, deadly increases in heat. How will we survive? These are concerned scientists, and they say as heat-trapping emissions rise, each region of the country is projected to experience an increase in the average number of days per year with heat above the thresholds analyzed in this study. And then they show these red-hot maps of the country burning up. And I'll tell you what, I'm sitting here in my office in Boulder, Colorado. It's 95 degrees outside. It's probably close to 90 in the office. Boy, it's hot. We better do something about these heat-trapping emissions. But first, let's look to see if there's any validity to the claims made by the Union of Concerned Scientists. These heatwave graphs are from the official U.S. government National Climate Assessment. They show the length of heat waves has dropped sharply since the 1930s. They show that the magnitude of heat waves has dropped sharply since the 1930s. And they show that the maximum temperature in heat waves has also dropped sharply during the 1930s. The blue dots in this map show that the peak temperature in most of the U.S. has declined since the first half of the 20th century. So as CO2 has increased, heat waves have decreased sharply. So we already have enough information in front of us to see that the Union of Concerned Scientists report is completely fraudulent. But I'm going to go into much more detail exposing their malfeasance. This is a graph of the percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and 105 degrees Fahrenheit at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations. The blue, red, yellow, and green lines are the trend lines. They're all down. The 1930s was much hotter. The 1950s was much hotter. 1980 was much hotter. 1988 was much hotter. 1901 was extremely hot. There were extremely hot years in 1911 and 1913. Recent years have been among the coolest on record. And the next graph plots the same thing, except this one shows along the x-axis carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere rather than time. You can see from the trend lines that every category of heat has declined as carbon dioxide levels have increased. The frequency of 90-degree days has decreased. The frequency of 95-degree days has decreased. The frequency of 100-degree days has decreased. And the frequency of 105-degree days has also decreased as carbon dioxide levels have increased. So once again, the entire basis of the Union of Concerned Scientists report is fraudulent. They're claiming that heat waves correlate with carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. It's clear that that simply isn't true. Now let's look at those regions of the country in the same order which they did. Well, heat in the Midwest has plummeted over time, dramatically. The Midwest used to have extremely hot summers until about 1955. But since then, the frequency of 90-degree days has dropped off sharply and are pretty rare now. 95 and 100-degree days were very common in the Midwest during the 1930s, but they almost never happen anymore. Now let's look at the Union of Concerned Scientists predictions again. They predicted an increase in the Midwest from 25 days per year up to 90 days per year. Well, the exact opposite is occurring. These people are terrible scientists at best and complete frauds at worst. Now let's look at the northeastern U.S. The frequency of hot days has also declined there, though not as dramatically as they have in the Midwest. In the northern plains, the frequency of hot days has dropped off sharply. Look how incredibly hot the northern plains were during the 1930s. Recent years have been the coolest on record. If you remember your Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath from high school, millions of people fled the heat and drought of the 1930s in the Great Plains and moved to California. You can see why. The heat was unbearable in the 1930s. The Pacific Northwest has seen a small increase in the frequency of hot days since the 19th century. But almost all of that increase occurred over a century ago. This is the same graph for the past century. You can see there's been no change in the frequency of hot days. The southeastern U.S. has seen a sharp drop in the frequency of hot days. Prior to 1960, it was much hotter in the southeastern U.S. The southern plains has also seen a sharp drop in the frequency of hot days. They had a very hot year in 2011 and 2012, but generally the trend has been downward fairly sharply. And there were a lot of very hot days in the first half of the 20th century. Also, 1980 was an extremely hot year in the southern plains. The summer of 1980 is folklore in Texas now. Like the Northwest, the Southwest has also seen an increase in the number of hot days. Once again, it all occurred more than a century ago. Over the past century, there's been little or no change in the frequency of hot days in the southwestern U.S. So the Union of Concerned Scientists is batting zero with their claim extreme heat will become more frequent and more severe in all regions of the country. The exact opposite is occurring. The U.S. has a long history of terrible heat waves. During the summer of 1896, a 10-day heat wave killed nearly 1,500 people in New York City. Australia also had their record heat wave during January of 1896. New York Times, August 18, 1896. Hottest of hot waves on record. How it struck sweltering New South Wales in January last. Talking about hot weather, one day last January the mercury at Adelaide, Australia marked 127 degrees in the shade. And then at the bottom of the article they show an incredible string of hot days in New South Wales over the entire month of January. Now let's look at the headlines from the New York Times from the heat wave of 1901. June 29, 1901. Heat brings death and much suffering. June 30th, 1901. New York wilts in protracted heat. Many dead and prostrated. July 1st, 1901. The city of Furnace, virtually deserted. July 2nd, 1901. Heat's Holocaust in the 5 boroughs. 87 deaths and 178 prostrations. Hottest July 1st on record. July 3rd, 1901. Heat brings death to over 200 persons. July 4th, 1901. 200 more dead before rain falls. Now let's look at the heat wave of 1911. July 4th, 1911. Heat kills 100 over country. That heat wave actually killed thousands of people in the Northeast. Tuesday, July 4th, 1911. Crazed by heat, kills himself. Orange, New Jersey. Made insane by the heat early this morning, Rafael Catua just landed from Italy, seized a razor and slashed his abdomen, throat, and wrist. And also during the summer of 1911, Paris had a massive heat wave which killed more than 40,000 people. Compare that to 0 deaths in this year's heat wave. I'm not going to spend much time on the heat waves of the 1930s, which were by far the worst in U.S. history, but here's an article from July 25, 1936. Heat wave toll over 12,086 U.S. cities this week. There's a very simple explanation for why heat waves aren't as severe in the U.S. as they used to be, and that's because the U.S. is getting wetter. In fact, the last 12 months has been by far the wettest on record. And if you remember from the graph I showed you earlier, the last 6 months have also been the coolest on record in the United States. Cool and wet go together, and hot and dry also go together, like in the 1930s. Unfortunate that the Union of Concerned Scientists doesn't seem to understand basic physics. This graph from Oxford University shows the bottom line of their fraud, however. The death rate from natural disasters around the world has plummeted since the 1920s. The Union of Concerned Scientists is trying to scare people into taking what they call climate action by making them afraid that they will die in the heat. But as carbon dioxide levels have increased in the atmosphere, death rates from natural disasters have plummeted. This is the exact opposite of the claims being made by the Union of Concerned Scientists. Now let's look at the last part of their fraud, their claim that the United States can take unilateral climate action. Even if you believe that atmospheric carbon dioxide levels control the climate, there's very little evidence the United States has any control over them. China emits twice as much carbon dioxide as the United States, and their levels are skyrocketing even as the U.S. levels are decreasing. And China is building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants. Look at this amazing Orwellian headline from the New York Times. As Beijing joins climate fight, Chinese companies build coal plants, as if somehow Chinese companies could build coal plants without the government's permission. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, as measured at Mauna Loa Observatory, have been increasing exponentially for a long time, and each of these climate agreements has had zero impact on the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. The whole idea of climate action is a complete farce. There's nothing the U.S. could do alone, even if we wanted to. So what are these scientists at the Union of Concerned Scientists up to? Well, Rachel Licker is working to defend climate science budgets and programs. Without scaring people, there's no money for climate science budgets. And Christy Dahl at the Union of Concerned Scientists is feeling blue about climate change. It's been a tough year for those of us in the climate change community. Well, perhaps instead of relying on emotion, Christy Dahl should do some actual science, like I did. No doubt millions of dollars went into this fraudulent report from the Union of Concerned Scientists. But I work for free, and it took me less than 2 hours to completely dissemble the nonsense in their report. Upton Sinclair, the playwright, said, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." No place is this principle more evident than in climate science, and obviously it applies to women as well as men. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.